But I think that before all of those things, I think just really going back to what we were talking about before of just like, you got to grapple with the fact that like whatever you think learning was supposed to be, or whatever you think kids did in traditional school is not really what's happening, right? So you think a kid's learning from, 9 to 4, they're not. Right. And so there's all these things that you just believe about young people and learning, and that learning looks this way. Learning looks like sitting down in front of a notebook and writing stuff down. Learning doesn't look fun, or learning doesn't look like, going on a field trip somewhere, but it really can look so much like anything. So I think that's a huge thing that adults everywhere are going to just have to continue to work through, is we've romanticized and modeled this idea of this is how learning looks. And we have to just like really let that go, which is a huge process.
As a young mother, I experienced a paradigm shift that transformed how I saw education and ultimately the world around me. I started this podcast, The Luminous Mind, to connect with and learn from people who are disrupting the status quo in how they learn, educate, and live in the world around them. Prepare for a paradigm shift. Light a candle, light your world.
Benjamin Franklin said, "Instead of cursing the darkness, light a candle." You're listening to The Luminous Mind with your host, Rebecca Bowman.
Today's fire starter is Cassidy Younghans. Cassidy Younghans is a certified educator who taught 7th grade English in the public schools for 5 years before shifting her path towards self-directed education. She interned at multiple alternative educational spaces, including North Star with 23 years of history, and Houston Sudbury School in 2018 and 19, before founding Epic Life Learning Community in September of 2019. Epic Life Learning Community serves ages 4 through 18 in Carrollton, Texas. Welcome, Cassidy.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you be part of our conversation. Like we were saying before we even started recording, that we need to see these types of learning communities all over the place. But before we get into any of your background and what you're doing now, go ahead and tell our audience a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. So I'm 28. I am from Dallas-Fort Worth and live there now. I currently have a boyfriend that I live with, and I'm a mom. I have an 8-year-old sister and 4 amazing parents and step-parents who have helped raise me. I have a lot of outside passions besides just education, but education is my main passion. But I'm also interested in art and music and singing and creating art. And yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I'd love to hear like some background information. In your bio, we read that you're a certified teacher and that you taught in public school for 5 years before shifting to self-directed education. Give us the background of what it was like to be a teacher and then why you decided to switch.
Yeah. So kind of still back in about myself, it's funny because I've wanted to be a teacher since I was like 2 years old. I would line up my Barbies and be like, here's what we're going to learn. And I had worksheets that I made for my dad and different things like that I was like, get something wrong so I can grade you. So I loved playing teacher, and it's something that I knew I wanted to do my whole life. And so I think I ended up going into public education with a little bit of an idealized version of what my role could be and what my impact could be. So I went and I became a 7th grade English teacher. I got out of college in 4 years, did the traditional path, was like, okay, I'm just going to go to be a teacher in the grades I want to do. So I did 7th grade. English was what I wanted to teach. And I taught for 5 years at one school that was a fine arts school of choice. So it was a public school in Dallas-Fort Worth, but it was also specifically focused on fine arts. And I taught there for 5 years, but what I kept seeing was like systemically, right? I can be the most open teacher. I can have my, classroom open after school for kids who need things. I can be that support. I can try to be creative with my lessons. But the reality is the system itself is quite oppressive to a lot of kids. And so kind of coming to that realization in year 2 or 3 was a lot. And then it was really great because actually Blake Bowles, who I think was the one that connected us for this podcast.
Yep.
He was a huge inspiration for me. He came down to speak at a conference that I was helping organize, and him and I just talked, and I was like, this is just not in alignment with who I am, and I don't feel fit to do anything else. So that was tricky because I was like, okay, I don't love the system that I'm in. I love working with young people. What else can I do? So him and I spoke for a while, and we talked about, I was a little interested in self-directed education prior to speaking with him. And so, but I was like, I don't understand how I'm supposed to leave traditional path and just like own it, all of that. And so it was really challenging, and nobody feels, I guess, well, maybe I didn't feel, and possibly a lot of other people did not feel equipped to leave this prepaid path that they've done pretty successfully. I was a pretty successful public school teacher. The kids and I had great relationships. I had test scores, quote unquote, at the end of each year. And so it's hard to really veer from one path to something that's uncharted and unfamiliar. And oftentimes there's not very many people who have done it before. So that kind of took me a while to get to that place where I was able to leave. But after 5 years, I did leave, and it was definitely worth it. I could probably talk about all of that forever. So
yeah. Well, and so when you're a public school educator, and I find it interesting that you said you're basically teaching a school of choice. So you're teaching students that choose to be there. And then that in and of itself carries a little bit, I mean, it's not like a traditional public school where everyone's there just based off of zip code. These are children that chose to be there, right? Like in families.
Yeah, I can add to that. Yeah. So it was interesting because there was a certain percentage of the kids who were supposed to be within the district. So there was I think it was about 50% of the kids that went to the school of choice were supposed to be kids that were in the school district that the school of choice was in. And then the other 50% could be opened up to kids outside of that zip code area.
Okay.
And it was because it's a fine arts school, there was even a process where they had to interview and do an audition. So it was definitely something where, their parents had to be aware of what was happening, and they had to also have kind of a little bit of a gift coming in. So it definitely was a unique experience, not just, comparative to a lot of the traditional public school experiences.
Yeah, I think that's why it surprises me so much because, I know a little bit about charter schools, and I know that children who are there are usually, they tend to still be, they're there because they're choosing to be there, not like they're forced to be there. So, they have the dynamic is a little bit higher, you know what I mean, with those types of children. So you're saying that really it was the system, because even though this was like a school of choice and there was all this interviewing process, it's like the government bureaucracy, right, is like the problem that you dealt with mostly.
Oh my gosh. Yes. So you're really hitting the nail on the head around that, because it's true. It's one of those things where I went in thinking like, oh my gosh, this is my ideal job. I'm in a job where there's a lot of like self-expression through music and arts. And I was telling you earlier, I love arts and music and those kinds of things. And so there was a lot of like encouragement for young people to be expressing themselves and perform and share what they're passionate about. So I was like, that's amazing. And then like you're saying, still though, even though, we had, I was able to put like a safe space sign in front of my door and have a gay straight alliance group and things like that, which are kind of outside of other public school experiences that I understand from some of my colleagues. It was very much more open, so the kids could have like blue hair if they wanted to. There was more creative expression that was held there, and even still, right? And even still, it was almost worse, because it was like, oh, we're like, open, and we want to be outside of the box and creative, but at the very same time, they're like, yeah, but if we don't get 97% passing, it doesn't, none of that other stuff matters. All of the other stuff goes out the window.
And a lot of times you have to follow like a state curriculum. So certain things are required. And so it almost takes up so much time that kids aren't able to really find out work on those passions that they love, right? I mean, like that's just this little side blur that's like there, but it's not really something they can pursue with full force, right? Like,
right. And I was in a district where there was 3, 6, and 9 week testing. So every 3 week, 6 week, and 9 week, we had to stop what we were doing in my class and take a test that was written by the district that was modeled after the STAR test, which is the standardized assessment in Texas. And so every 3 weeks, these young people were tested to make sure that they were on track to pass or do well in STAR. So even though, right, we're in this progressive model in theory within the public school system, again, there were just so many things that were holding us back. And then I ended up having to pull kids out of those amazing fine arts classes, right? As this public school English teacher, I'm like, oh, wait, you're not going to maybe pass this, test. So I got to pull you out of your passion.
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
Right. So that's very weird to me. Didn't feel in alignment at all with how I feel like young people should be treated. But
yeah, exactly. Well, and you were saying that before you met Blake Bowles, that you had a little bit of background with self-directed education. I'd love to hear like your progression through that of like what you were learning and, how you found that intriguing and that kind of thing. And then how that kind of worked to change that paradigm for you.
Yeah, totally. So I'll go back just a little tiny bit. So when I was younger, when I was a learner, I'm not a learner, we're always learners, sorry. When I was a student, I went to a Montessori school from ages like 4 to 9. And I just remember that being an amazing experience for me. And so I had a little seed planted there of like, there is some alternative, progressive alternative possibly that already exists from my own experience as a child. So I went to public school, and it was actually a huge shock for me because I went from this little community, a small community where everybody just accepted each other. And there was a lot of co-learning happening and individual learning happening to like this public school model. So I actually experienced that myself as a child a little bit. Cool. And so it kind of planted a seed like, okay, there's got to be more stuff going on out there. I'm not loving what I see. I don't think it's serving enough kids. I don't think it's healthy for them or for teachers for that matter. And so there's got to be some other systems that have, are being created outside of the traditional model that I can check out. So while I was teaching public school, actually, it's funny because our principal, again, I was telling you, she wanted us to think outside of the box. So she would show us these amazing TED Talks, right? I don't know if you've seen Sir Ken Robinson's Schools Kill Creativity, right?
Yeah.
And that she also showed us Logan LaPlante, who was 13 at the time when he spoke on this TED Talk. He did one called Hack Schooling Makes Me Happy.
Oh, yeah.
And it was all about how he hacks his education, right? Mm-hmm. And she shows us these videos in the context of the public school sphere during a staff meeting. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like you realize that you just totally like maybe and now have to go seek out other options, because it was very stifling to be sitting and her being like, yeah, so talk to kids about how they can hack their education within the system that's extremely confining and oppressive and tells them that they can't learn anything on their own.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense.
Well,
so that was really challenging.
And I feel like we waste a lot of kids' time, and then they don't have time to pursue their passion. They're exhausted at that point, of trying to work within the system. At least that's what I fear mostly, is that it's not really that they don't have a desire to hack their education. They just don't have time. We're expecting them to get all this other stuff done before they can really work on the stuff that they love. It makes it really difficult for kids to even want to do that. Then the fire of their passion kind of blows out, and, they just get stuck in the same thought processes.
Yeah. And so much of what we see, if we actually step back and watch, instead of trying to, hold kids to like, you have to learn these prerequisites before you can get to X, Y, Z that you really love. Oftentimes, once they get to what they really love, they actually have to incorporate a lot of what we thought they needed to learn first. But they can do that instead in their own creative way, in their own natural process of, going into their passion deeply. And then a lot of those skills still are completely, acquired, just not in the way that our linear progression in the traditional environment expects, right? Yeah,
we have a really weird idea of thinking like you have to learn these steps, but when we're working, even when you're working in one specific skill, you bring in so many other, you bring in writing skills, you bring in math skills. We don't realize how we've separated all those things out. When you're really working with your passion, you're actually kind of pulling a lot of that stuff back in. That's one thing I guess I learned as I was going through the experiences. Like, we're also worried about, making sure these one specific skills are being worked on, that we've really taken out the opportunity to do education like the rest of adults do it, where it's all meshed together, it's all working together. Well, you also said in your bio that you worked at a couple different alternative education spaces like North Star and the Houston Sudbury School, and stuff like that. So, why did you decide to found the EPIC Life Learning Community?
Yeah, well, totally. Sorry, I'm going to back up like 2 seconds because there's a little bit of a gap in between. So from when I met Blake was when I was helping with a conference that Macarios Community School, which was the first Democratic school in Dallas-Fort Worth. I went there. So backing up just to when I was still seeing all these videos and going, oh my gosh, what's going on? Hack schooling makes me happy, all of that stuff. I ended up being like, okay, there's got to be some alternatives out there. And so I looked, locally in the area for progressive schools. I found this school called Macarios. And so I just went there one day when I had a day off of teaching and was like, please tell me everything. And a young person answered the phone, and a young person was the one that gave me the tour. And I didn't even really figure out they were a young person until halfway through the situation, because they were just so well-spoken and empowered.
Oh, that's
and
cool.
When I visited there, they didn't have any job openings. They were still super new. But the owner, the creator, had said, I want to create a conference around self-directed education to spread awareness in Texas, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in the South, about this alternative. And so that's when I got involved in creating the conferences called Self-Directed Path that Blake ended up coming down for. And then the next year we had Dr. Peter Gray come down. And then the next year we had Joel Hammond come down from Princeton. He's founder of Princeton.
I've talked to all three of those. That's awesome.
That's amazing. I love all of them. They're incredible humans, and we've had to bring them down from the North in different places to share all about self-directed education here. And it's been such a gift. So through that process and then meeting Blake kind of said, okay, like, what do you want to do to kind of help yourself feel equipped to move to the next phase? So I had to save up money. So my 4th year teaching, I was like planning my exit strategy. I was like, okay, I got to get out. I got to save money. And then I was also looking at internship opportunities for the following year. So I kind of decided for the year after I left school, like public school, that I was going to just spend time interning and visiting different alternative spaces, because it's funny because I'm like, oh my gosh, there's got to be some progressive alternative. And there are a lot. There are actually, I wish there was still way more, but there are a lot, and there's a lot of variance within the different models that exist within alternative education, right? Because we go from like Waldorf and Montessori, and then you go kind of into more eclectic homeschooling, liberated learners model, agile learning, all of those different things. And so I decided to take a year, almost like a sabbatical year, to visit all these different types of learning communities, because you can read about them all day and there's so much to read. And I definitely spent a lot of my time that 5th year teaching and that year interning reading a lot of different great books that have been published by people through this movement over the course of, over 60 years, and then way before we created public school. So with the reading combined with actually going and then seeing the spaces was ideal for me, because I felt like I really was able to take theory and put it into application. And so that was a really, really great experience. And so at Houston Sudbury School, I really got to see the Sudbury model and how it works for young people. And that was a really amazing thing, because Sudbury is very much like, if the kids request it, you can help, support that happening. But otherwise, you are very much just there as an equal person doing your own passions on, your own way. So it's not the same as like maybe how we have EPIC a little bit now, where we do have some offered classes. They're all opt-in. But we kind of have a little bit of that Summerhill vibe. I don't know if you're familiar with Summerhill.
I've heard of it.
Where there's just a lot, and agile learning centers oftentimes do this too. At EPIC, there's just a lot of different classes that we offer, and Liberated Learners does this. But we, of course, allow kids to say no thank you at any time. So it was really cool, though, to see at Houston Sudbury School, even when you don't offer anything, right? In the sense of, formal, let's hang out and learn something together. So it all happens anyway, and it happens in ways that you wouldn't expect. So I met a young girl there that really inspired me, because I didn't really still understand, how do you read? How do you learn how to read on your own, and okay, you're 9 years old and you can't read. Oh my gosh, I'm going to have a heart attack. But it was seriously just, I watched her for 3 months, just not really thinking she could read, and she would have to play games with someone else in order to be able to read the cards. And then one day she just decided she wanted to read. And within 2 weeks, she was, sitting down with her friends and reading like Dr. Seuss books and different things like that. And then, by the time I had left, she had already read multiple Harry Potter books.
Oh, wow.
So it shows how quick, if a kid really wants to learn something, when their brain is ready, when they're ready to learn it, it can totally happen.
Well, and did you see, I would think that in that kind of environment, there's no shaming going on, like she's not like in a traditional school, you might, if you were 9 years old and you weren't reading, that might be a source of shame. They'd put you with the slow learners or something like that. What was the climate like in that environment?
You're completely right. I mean, it was a very like non-shaming environment. And if anything, some of the other learners would say, well, actually, you can read this, like you can read these letters or you can read these words. So they would also like almost like say, actually, you're saying you can't read, but you can read some things. You might not be able to read everything yet. So it's also interesting to see the young girl, because she was like, I can't read, but it was like, well, but reading is a huge scope, and there's a bunch of words that even I look at as an adult and I have to figure out, okay, how the heck am I supposed to say that? So
yeah.
And what does that mean? So it's a constant, right? Language is a constant acquisition. So it was cool to see that other learners there were like, oh my gosh, no, actually we've seen you. So they reflect it back to each other, right? We've seen you do this learning. Cool. And also it's like, okay, if you aren't ready to yet, right? So at 9, nobody was like, oh my gosh, at all. But exactly, in a traditional environment, oh my goodness. Yeah, they probably wouldn't be in the grade that their grade is associated with.
Yeah,
that their age is associated with.
Yeah, and there is a lot of shaming in that. That a lot of kids would hide it, and I think it's cool that she was so open with her feelings about wanting to read, and then they were supporting her versus like she was hiding it, because I think that's what would end up happening in the public school system. If a kid couldn't learn how to read and gasp, it happens all the time that, a kid isn't grasping the concepts and they get all the way through school and find out they can't even read. But they're scared to tell anybody or to talk to anybody about it because of that environment, for sure. So, you went through the traditional, even though you had the experience of that self-directed learning, you still went through like the traditional education, like a schooling process to prepare you to be a teacher. What was that overall like educational philosophy like when I just love the idea of thinking about like how we start at one point and we get to another. What was that, like some of those vast discoveries that you found in trying to change that educational philosophy?
Yeah. So are you asking about when I was a young person or as going with EPIC now?
No. Yeah. More of like that discovery of like, you want to move towards a self-directed education, but how you change that educational philosophy. Because I'm sure there were some things like the 9-year-old who, you wanted to watch the whole process of learning how to read, but were there other things besides that were like, wow, I didn't realize that, or I didn't realize this?
Definitely.
Do you want to talk about any of those?
Yeah. So I think that some of it also is like, I had to reckon with like when I really came to terms with what education kind of was, and that I was literally gatekeeping whether they could go to the bathroom in the traditional system. I had to kind of really cope with this idea that like I spent 5 years of my life thinking I was doing this really great thing for young people. And in fact, I may have been, and most likely was, in various scenarios, even when trying to do my best, oppressing young people and using my power and all of these things that like you don't really see. And then I read the book, A Different Kind of Teacher by John Taylor Gatto, and it just smacks you in the face. It's like, do you understand like that you think you're like this big savior helping kids and all this stuff, and like really you're teaching them that their own voice doesn't matter, and that, all of these different things, and through being a part of this system. And so I think that having to come to terms with, okay, here is that I might have done some harm in the system, and that the only thing I can do now, right, is move forward and continue to grow and be in that growth process of understanding that there's a million oppressive systems that we're working within, and how do we create new things outside of that can then counter and eventually, allow people to move in a different direction where they're not feeling so oppressed. So I think you have to kind of come to terms with what you've done, and also your own education, right? So if you had a really great educational experience, or if you felt like you didn't have a good educational experience, doing all that work as an adult yourself when you're moving into self-directed education, I think is absolutely necessary, because you have to come to terms with your own experience and then also what you've done in the educational field before you can really be open to, the new model mindset.
I think that's really powerful, because I think one of the reasons why we are having such a difficult time changing the structured classroom as it is, I mean, it basically hasn't changed since, the inception of traditional public education. And they say that that's because there are so many teachers. They actually did really well in that system, and they perpetuate it. They just keep it going because it worked for them. And so they feel like that's true education, because they they were successful in it or something. You know what I mean?
Just to add to what you're saying, we had somebody come speak to some educators at one point, and he made all the educators mad because the educators were like, well, it's such a great testament to us as educators when our kids grow up and become educators. And the speaker, he goes, actually, I think they grow up to become educators because that's the only job they've seen.
Yes.
Their entire education. That's the only job they've been exposed to. So that's an interesting thought too, to go along with what you're saying. There's this idea that teachers, when they're young people in school, they thrive in that environment. And so then they perpetuate that environment. And then also, right, we're not exposing other young people to a variety of industries and jobs. And so then oftentimes that can also funnel them back into this loop of just constantly being in school, being the student to being the teacher.
Yeah, it's like a really sick loop, never ends.
Yeah. And it can feed, right? It can feed into itself for sure.
Yes. Yeah. And then it never changes because of that. And I love the idea of where you're talking, it's almost like a reckoning or repentance, of like, how did I add to the system that was so oppressive, where we have to kind of do this self-evaluation. And I don't think that goes on enough. There's too much defense of like what I'm doing is, helpful, but we don't really look at it for what it is. We're not really holding a mirror.
So much work.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're not. And it's so much work, right? Public school teaching is a lot of work. If you really care and you're trying your best, it's a lot of work, right? I had 161 kids that I taught for 1 year, like a year at a time, 161 kids that I was supposed to teach English.
Wow.
And so every time you give an essay, you have 161 essays to grade, right? And then they do revisions, and then you have 161 revisions. And do you know what I mean? So if you really are the teacher that's looking at all those essays and you don't even really committing to those processes, you really are doing a ton of work. So it's also really like just frustrating and makes you kind of angry when you think about maybe some of that work was actually possibly damaging or not as helpful as you really thought it was.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, we don't recognize teachers for what they can be. I think that's the saddest part when you specifically see teachers unions being so defensive of that traditional school. And I feel like we don't give teachers enough credit to think that they can possibly teach the way, that autonomy, give them the autonomy, I guess, to teach the way that they feel would be best for themselves or their students. We treat them, I think their own system treats them horribly, but then it's always cast that people don't appreciate them, and that we don't appreciate them for who they are.
Right.
What a fun topic. I'd love to know though, so like we were saying, you worked for a couple different alternative education spaces already, but why did you decide to found this epic learning community in September of 2019?
Yeah. So this crazy thing happened where after interning at a bunch of different places, I was learning about all the different tools and ways of self-directed education, and I was able to bring those back. And actually on the bus ride back to the airport from Massachusetts, coming back to Texas from my internship at North Star, I got a call from my friend that had been organizing the conference with me in the past that we had done in Dallas. And she called me and said, oh my gosh, okay, Makarios, that school that I mentioned to you earlier, the first school in DFW that was Democratic, is moving an hour away. They're moving locations and they need to move an hour away because their founder is too far away from where they live. This is an amazing facility that they're going to get an hour away that's going to be way better for their kids. And so they need to move. And in that, of course, there were kids that couldn't make that hour drive, right? That aren't going to be able to, maybe they're already 30 minutes the other way. DFW is pretty big. And so they were moving from a Dallas suburb to Fort Worth. So it really was about an hour away. And so there were families that were like, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to make it over there. We love this model. We really believe this is the way we want our kids to be able to learn. And so another one of the parents that was affected by that, she felt that she was called to start something that would be in the local, that would be close enough to the families that were losing a space. And so she was willing to front fund and finance that project. And like I said, my friend that had been doing this conference with me had spoken with her, and the three of us kind of came together and were like, let's make this happen. It came together so quickly, and it was literally as I was coming back from finishing my last internship. So and I got back, I guess like mid-March, and then from mid-March all the way to September, we were just working, trying to make this thing a reality.
That's cool. And So it was really just out of need, almost like a market. The market was calling for it type of thing. So
the market was calling for it. And I think for me, Dallas is, it's where I grew up, it's where I'm from. And I do feel that we don't have enough self-directed learning communities or options in this area at all. In the South in general, I feel like we're still kind of lacking. We have a lot of like homeschool communities, but oftentimes they're not very secular. And so I feel very strongly that our area really needs it. And so that was also kind of why, instead of like going and being a part of a learning community that already existed somewhere else, I really wanted to start something because I also felt like there was a need here. Specifically because I would have loved to work at any of the communities that I interned at. They're all amazing.
That's cool. Well, and I love the idea that you're doing that in the community that you know and that you have that connection with. I think that's great. What are the challenges? I mean, I know, talking with Joel Hammond and a lot of those different democratic school starters, I know there's a lot of challenges to starting this type of thing. What were some of those and what did you learn from those challenges? I mean, there might be other people out there just like you that are like, hey, I want to start this kind of education for myself. Could you kind of walk them through maybe some things that they'd face?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think the thing that you just, that when I just explained what happened, that came together beautifully for me, but doesn't really come easily for most people when creating something like this, is a team, right? Finding other people right where you are in your local area that want to create something with you. So it was great because I kind of had that come to me a little bit. But after, spending a lot of time really, like you were saying, kind of networking in Dallas, Fort Worth, so you have these connections that then can reach out to you. So getting a team is a huge thing. Getting a team together that you can work with instead of starting something like completely on your own, I would say is huge. I think I learned that a lot of what I learned in just creating a learning community that's not, that doesn't have these systems in the same way, is that you really have to ground into relationship and be willing to have hard conversations. I think that is a huge part of creating these kinds of learning communities. You have to be willing to have hard conversations with parents, with each other as people that are starting something together, because you can start something together and have tons of similar values and still have certain things that you just very much disagree on. So then how do you move forward? So having really hard conversations and leaning into that instead of being like, oh my gosh, another parent conversation or whatever was super important, but also like a hard growing process, because I think as a public school teacher, I was almost sheltered from a lot of that. Like you think you have to deal with a lot as public school teacher with families, but you really don't. Like you get some emails, maybe when you're younger, if you have younger kids, you deal with parents more. But when you're with, middle school and high school, you really don't in the same way. And you don't work with other adults in the same way. I had my own classroom and every day I would shut my door and I was with kids like the majority of the day. And I didn't have other teachers that I planned with, quote unquote. Like I was the only 7th grade English teacher at that school. So I didn't even have to sit down with other teachers and have conversations about things we wanted to do together and make decisions. I just did them. You know what I mean? I just did it. Yeah. So I think that I had to learn a lot about working with others and then working with adults, and then just the whole idea of having hard conversations when you create something like this that you want to not be super power structured and hierarchical, and you want everybody's voice to be heard, whether they're kids or whether they're adults. You have to have hard conversations. That's a big one.
That's awesome. What were some of those conversations like? I mean, I think when we have a system, for example, we have that school system, I'm going to say that again, but we seem to think that we can just walk through things and not really, like they've got it all planned out for us. And, there's all of this, like we know one step and then the next step and those types of things. And so I agree with you that there's not enough like collaboration and there's not enough that kind of thing, working together. We're just working them through that system. But what were some of those hard conversations that you had to have with people?
So I think that part of going back to like the philosophy of EPIC is that we're co-creating a learning experience with the child and the parent. Mm-hmm. So we have to have conversations all the time about, like, as a child, what do you value and what do you care about spending your time doing? As a parent, what do you value? And really, are the few things that like really you're just like, oh my gosh, I really need you to do math once a week or something. And then, from our perspective as EPIC, I'm not willing to force any child to do anything that they're not willing to do. I'm willing to iterate and try so many different options with them if they're willing to try them, but I'm not willing to force them to do something just because their parent feels they need to, or because a system feels they need to. So that conversation in itself with every family is a hard conversation, because you're saying, where can we meet in the middle? Where can we meet so that you have your needs met as the parent and your concerns are met and you're getting enough information that you understand what's going on with your child's education, and then that the child gets their needs met and is able to explore and have that freedom, and then that we as EPIC still stay true to that value, that we're not gonna, if a kid says no thank you, we're gonna respect that.
Yeah. I do find it interesting when I talk to people who are starting like these democratic schools, that it really is a challenge to try to get parents unschooled or deschooled, what I should say, because I mean, a lot of us went through the system and we think we know what education looks like, but when we're watching it in our children in one of these, and it may not feel right to your soul, like to move them through that system, but then there's like these alarm bells that go off, like when they're not moving through those milestones or through a system, we feel like, oh my gosh, this isn't going to turn out well, or we're just scared about what it should be. So I really understand, like, trying to train your parents might be some of the toughest things that you have to do. Do you have like when you sit down with them, I would imagine most people probably come to you because they want this type of thing, but do you have some type of, standard, I guess, talk or something training or something for the parents?
Yeah, we try. I think that that's still something that we're growing in as EPIC specifically. I'm really grateful for organizations like wider, like the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, and podcasts like this, Blake's podcast, Akila Richards' podcast, different resources that are being created as a movement has been really helpful, because to be honest with you, right, we're a startup. There's so much to be done, and onboarding the parents is definitely a process. And also, it's not just, I want to support them, right? Because kind of like you heard me talking about my journey, like it wasn't wrong for me to be scared that 9-year-old couldn't read, right? Like it wasn't wrong. Like that was a natural thing. And a lot of parents are going to have that same response. And it came from my traditional, English teacher background of like, oh my gosh, how's she going to like function? But then I got to see it in real time, this girl go through this process, and parents don't have the luxury or the time to always see things like that come to fruition for another child or for their own child before having to make this decision to do something alternative. So then how do you package those kinds of experiences that I was able to have, or that, children in other places have been able to have, to help parents understand that it's really possible? And then, I think it's fair for parents to say, well, that's very anecdotal. And so that's challenging, right? Because there are some statistics and there's some data points that, again, Dr. Peter Gray and Gina Riley and other people have created, and North Star has some great statistics too. And they're still very limited to small groups of people, and oftentimes they're self-reported. So there is some, it's a little slanted and not extremely reliable. And so that's really tricky, because like it does feel very true in my soul. Like it's an alignment thing, right? Like I believe that this is the kind of education that young people should be able to have access to. All young people should have the choice. But to onboard parents to get to that same place, the amount of work I had to do for myself to get there, as a parent, I can only imagine. And I'm also not a parent. So I feel sometimes very, not imposter syndrome, but something like that, right? When I'm trying to tell them like, oh, here's how your kid's going to be fine. It's like, well, are you a parent? So that's a little tricky for me too sometimes, because I understand that like as a person who wants to have children, I'm going to have to grapple with all of this on another level when I have kids. Yeah. Like I'm someone in the movement, and I'll still have to be like, okay, everything's fine. You know what I mean? And call other people that are in this and talk me down a little bit too. Yeah. Because you have family and stuff that question, and you have outside people too in the society at large that make it even more challenging.
Yeah. I really love the fact that you didn't put any shame on the parents for being worried about that. Because I think in the movement, we kind of get like that. Like we get, and I feel like part of it, one of the reasons why we're always praising this style of learning and not really looking, like you said, I mean, it's very anecdotal, is because the only way we could experiment with this was like homeschooling. And as when you have your children at home and they're supposed to be learning, you become very defensive and protective of that. And so you don't want to show the nastiness of it, you know what I mean? Or you don't want to show like the real and raw side. Like we just want to show like the Mary Poppin side of it, and not like what we should really be worried about type of thing.
Yeah. The vulnerable side of it. Yeah. I think that's so true, because you are in a defense mech. I felt that way. I mean, even when I left public education, right? I felt like I needed to be defensive to the public educators that were asking me like, what the heck are you doing? You're such a good teacher in the system. Like, why would you leave? What are you thinking? So I felt that same way. So I could see definitely how parents would feel defensive when they've made this alternative choice and then have people constantly, questioning it or wondering or, not understanding. And then their kids have, come home and say, well, am I not learning what I'm supposed to be learning because so-and-so says that, in public school, they're learning this. There's so much.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I love what Blake Bowles said, and I've, I interviewed other Democratic schools, and that was kind of the consensus of like, we look at all the anecdotal information, but really it came down to the fact of like, it's not hurting them. I'm not hurting those children. That in fact,
you're not. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're going to end up being no better off or no worse off maybe than they would be in their traditional school for sure. And I think that puts a lot of parents at ease. Like we kind of have this like, oh, they're going to go to the school and they're going to become the next Einstein, but really the reality is that they just become the people who they're supposed to be. And that we know that they're really not any worse off than they might be in like traditional school. And so I think like keeping those expectations at a normal level maybe, or I think as an educator, sometimes you could have a Pollyannish view. I mean, I do that a lot when I coach parents. I talk about all the amazing things that they can do, and really it's not as simple as that, as it is like you're just not going to hurt them any more than they would be in the traditional school. So, and they might be happier, on top of that. So
completely. Like, it can get tricky too so kind of like when you go to homeschooling, I've seen something similar happen when someone starts a learning community. So maybe I was a homeschool parent before, or maybe it's just me, right? And I've decided I'm going to start a liberated learners model. And I get so like dogmatically entrenched in understanding everything that has to do with liberated learners and their history and the way that every school is supposed to work that's a liberated learners model and all of that stuff. And then I try to, replicate that and really become defensive over that specific model. And that can become a problem too, because, and this is something that Blake Bowles touches on, which I love, that sometimes kids are, there's a certain type of learning community that works for them for some point in their life. And then they need to move to some other, hybrid of type of learning. So sometimes, they spend some time in a Montessori school, and then they spend some time at an agile learning center. And then they spend, some time a gap year in 8th grade where they go and they stay with their cousin, and then they come back, and then they, you know what I mean? And then they go to Sudbury School for high school. And then, they get a homeschool diploma, and then they go, to Berkeley and make their own degree like Blake or something. There's not one linear way. Sometimes they might go to public school for a few years. And so I think that we need to be really careful when we get defensive over a specific learning model that we've decided our learning community is, because that also limits us from looking at our community's needs and iterating. And trying different things. And we get very dogmatic, and then we get defensive and get really, we romanticize that dogma. So if I just think, the liberated learners model is just the answer for every learner, that liberated learners model would fix everything for them, then we're back in public school again.
Yeah, we're back
Same
to
thing.
Reiterating that, over and over.
One model works for everyone.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
This one system is going to fix it for everyone.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't matter if it's like, a really cool self-directed alternative. If we get really dogmatic about it, it just becomes a problem in itself too.
Yeah, and it stops the learning and the growth for the whole community. I mean, when we think we have the answer and we are the answer, then
you start selling it.
Really, yeah, no, and then you're not willing to listen to like what might work better and change and grow, as a community for sure. So
it's so true, because that's something that I did not want to happen when we were creating this learning community. Is I did not want to feel like a salesperson. I do not want to sell your kid on self-directed learning or sell you on self-directed learning. I do not want to convince you to do something as a parent that is not your best judgment. That's not what I want to do. It's not in alignment with who I am. And I want to create a community that is available, that's really open, but completely understands that you may come and spend 6 months with us. You may come and spend 5 years with us. You may come and learn about that you can leave public school, and that's enough for you to be like, okay, I choose to stay now, right? But I know I have options. So like really not attaching ourselves as a learning community to trying to just get numbers or to, again, be dogmatic about our model specifically. It can help open up a different kind of service to the community, like you're saying, that allows for iteration and adjusting and growth and feedback, which is huge. And I think that gave me a lot of freedom that I was scared of. I was really scared of that being a thing that I was going to have to do if I started a learning community, was like sell it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, that makes complete sense. Well, and I'd love to hear like your philosophy, maybe going with that. Sometimes when we start a school, we want to create like a mission, but I'd love to hear like what's the points or the mission that you have basically for your school. What's the messages that you want to kind of be the overarching theme throughout the learning?
Yeah. So I think like a lot of it is, it does go back to like holding space and also being very present. So having space where young people can come from, and we serve ages 4 to 18 and offering like all sorts of different resources that they can have at their disposal and empowering them to engage in those resources and engage with any of their own interests while still being these supportive facilitators that are present, that are willing to dive into any of your interests with you, that are willing to help you extend interests or learn something new if you need to in order to get to a specific goal. I think that we just want to be a space where we have like a rich, supportive space for people to grow and be intentional and engaged. We want kids to feel like they can create their own life. I think that's a big thing. So like kids being able to take what we've held space for them to do at Epic and then really feel empowered to move in just from wherever they are at age 7 or age 5, just start creating their own Epic life now. You don't have to wait. Like you were saying before, you don't have to wait until you're 18 and you're done with, the check boxes of the diploma. Let's do it now. And what would that look like? Right. So that's sometimes is some of our first questions to kids is like, what would your perfect day look like? And what, how can we make that what your days actually are like?
I love that. Well, and I think that sometimes when we have a school, that school is like, that's what we think about during that school time. But it sounds like what you're trying to do is create, this isn't just about a school. This is an education that's part of a way of life. Do you know what I mean? Like even being able to talk to the parents in an open dialogue and that kind of thing, and not take away like their freedom, even, or to oversell it. Like you were saying, that, you're not just an educator. This is like how you live your life. This is who you are versus like trying to be a salesman or an educator or whatever. Seems like the philosophy is more of a way of life.
I love that you say that. I think that's so true. And I hope that that's what, our learners feel as well. And that's kind of, I guess, ties completely into what I was saying before too, about like, we want kids to live their Epic life now, right? So we want it to be a way of life, right? You're not just coming here for your learning and then you leave. Right. And this is just a one moment of your entire life experience, which is all learning. Right. And is all, having hard conversations and being in community, like you're saying, it's all of those things. It's a way of life. It's integrating things that I think a lot of us yearn for, but don't have space or support to integrate.
That's awesome. So what does that space look like? I'd love to kind of know what your facility looks like. I mean, if learning can happen anywhere, how does your facility help to support that? Does that make sense? Like
completely.
When we think of schools, we think of, science labs and we think of, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I wish that we could, eventually build, something like our own, and build it where there's like, a bunch of natural lighting and a lot of really intentional spaces for young people. I know that there's amazing architecture that's, done. I've seen some stuff in Japan and different places that just would be, like life-changing, because I do think that the specific physical environment can have an impact. Right now, we are renting from a church. We struggled to find a place that was commercial that had a lot of nature. And land that kids could play on. And so we ended up collaborating with a Unitarian Universalist church, and we rent from them, and it's a great space. We actually get access to, I think, probably 10 rooms. Some of them are like smaller classrooms, and then there's probably 2 or 3 bigger rooms that all of our kids and more can fit into, and have like our community meeting and things like that. So we have different spaces for kind of the different developmental levels that we have at Epic. So since we have ages 4 to 18, you don't see them all doing the exact same thing every day, right? A 4-year-old might have a very different way they want to structure their day and a very different type of support that they want or need than a 17-year-old. So we have kind of different areas that they can, that they start their day in. So like the youngest group is called Foundation, and they have an area where they all sit in the morning and do, snack and have like a small circle time. It's a very short thing, but, they have their little area where they have developmentally appropriate toys and things that they can interact with. And then the middle group also has an area that's similar for their age group where they meet in the morning, and then the oldest group. So the youngest group is called foundation, the middle group is called exploration, and the older group is called direction. And I'm not saying ages because we want it to be very fluid and really just based on like where you are as a young person, what you need, and which structure is where you kind of want to be within EPIC at that moment. But generally it's like 4 to 7, 8, and then 8, 7, 8 to 11, 12, 13, and then 11, 12, 13 to 18. Kind of really depending on what each kid wants. Cause that's a conversation we have. It's like, do you want to kind of move into the next group or not? And we don't keep them isolated by any means in those different areas, but we find that in the morning, we want to provide some developmentally appropriate connection time within a little bit of a smaller age range. And then there is like the whole space is open for all of the different learners throughout the day and the afternoon for classes and different things like that. They just kind of have their own home base sections of the church, which is nice.
That's cool. Well, and I love the areas that you have. I'm actually trying to write them down because
like foundation, exploration, and direction.
Yeah, because I really think that if you were, an older teen coming into this, you might need to go back to that foundational level, of trying to figure out who you are and
honestly, it's so
what's really
cool.
important
Some
to
of
you.
the older kids like go play with the younger and middle kids, and you see them like filling these gaps in their themselves that they needed, and they do that on their own. Like you're saying, it's incredible. Or you see sometimes some kids that are like, oh, I can really bond with a couple of kids a couple years older than me, and this is a really riveting conversation I wouldn't have gotten to have if I was limited.
That's amazing. Well, I love the idea too that maybe the facility doesn't look like what you would think a regular school is, and really when you talk about providing them a space, it's more like support, collaboration, maybe people to bounce ideas off of, that kind of thing. Do you feel like that's more of like what the space provides, is kids to kind of discover who they are versus like, sitting down and, oh, I want to learn this or whatever, but it's more of a support system? Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's a huge thing. I think that because there are classes, like if you picture our regular day, there's usually 1 or 2 classes happening at any time that kids could be involved in. And at the same time, we also have different resources at their disposal. So yes, we hold this great space. And I think a lot of it really is holding space for them to de-school, like you mentioned earlier, holding space for them to just dive into their own interests. But we also provide, like we have an electronic drum kit and an electric guitar and an amp and a guitar. And we have a 3D printer, and we have a bearded dragon, and we have a therapy dog last year, and we have tons of art supplies, and we have like tinkering things and things for coding and, computers and different things like that. Yeah. So we have different things like that. And so there's also a lot to engage with. So it's definitely not an empty space by any means, but it is like we bring in materials and tools that make sense for the learners that we have. So we also have a community garden outside. We also have like some skateboards and scooters and things like that. Kids can bring their own. And so that's also cool because we also have learned, the process of like, okay, these are EPIC scooters versus this is your personal scooter, and okay, what are our agreements on who gets to use what? So there's lots of those kinds of conversations that happen throughout, the day, and just the way that we run a community, right? We had to figure out, okay, so this is, John's scooter. How does everybody know it's John's scooter? And if it's John's scooter, does anybody else get to ride John's scooter, or do you have to ask him first? Like, what's the process, right? And that process might be different for each kid, and they might have different preferences. And so then we have conversations as a community of like, okay, how do we find a practice that works for us? And then if that practice doesn't work, then we try something else. And so I'm digressing into that, but that's another element of what we do at EPIC is figuring out, how do we live in community together? Where does my freedom extend until it infringes upon your freedom?
I love that. That was my next thing I wanted to ask you about, because, we grew up in schools that were very authoritarian. A lot of people believe like if you're not there giving children discipline and telling them what to do or whatever, there's just going to be like Lord of the Flies kind of thing going on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. How do you handle strife or, disciplinary problems amongst, the members of the community or the students?
Sure. Yeah. So the first thing what I was just mentioning is called community awareness meeting. And we have that for about 15 minutes, 3 times a week. And we do really ask that at least the middle group and older group, we really, really are like, we're not like, I'm not going to force you to come, but we really would appreciate if you would come, just because we do think it's like, if we're going to create community practices and we don't have community members in the conversation, right, it doesn't work. So that was, that was a conversation, but they definitely agree to, and they understand that like, this is a way that we create processes together. And so we have this meeting called Community Awareness Meeting, and it is an agile learning tool. So if you know about Agile Learning Centers, it's a major pillar of what they do to run their centers. And it's all about living in community. So if you have a problem with something going on in the community, not something with going on with an individual, like if you and me, Rebecca, are having like a little tiff, we're having a fight or a misunderstanding, that's kind of a different thing. But if I'm talking about like the situation with John, where like I'm bringing my scooter and everybody keeps using my scooter without asking me, and I have a problem with that, and I want to understand, and I want to know what the community thinks about it. So you would bring that to the meeting, like, Tom would bring that to the meeting and put that up as an awareness. So it's not that it's a problem, it's an awareness. It's something he's aware of that's happening in the community that he maybe isn't cool with and wants to see what's going on with everybody else. And so then we have a conversation. Okay, is this something that we're seeing happening? Do we agree that it's kind of something that we should address? And then we talk about, why do we need to address it? Is the need that, John wants to feel respected? Is, or is it, if it's multiple learners, is there a need to feel respected? Is there a need because if something happens to the scooter, it will break and we won't know who did it and we won't know who can pay for it? You know what I mean? And so we have lots of conversation, and then we say, okay, what are some options of things we can try, of practices we can do? So maybe we label John's bike that it's John's, and we and everybody, if you're going to use someone's personal scooter, you need to ask them first. You know what I mean? And then we try that for a week, and we come back to the meeting next week and we say, how's that going? And if it's not going well, we iterate and we try something else. Or it's going well, but we need to change this one caveat to it. And then those practices kind of become norms in the community. So they kind of just over time, once they're an effective practice, they become integrated. And so once we integrate them, we don't have to like keep going over them because they're just naturally occurring in the community. Yeah. And then if they need to be adjusted, then we can always come back to them. There's not anything that's like a set in stone rule in those practices. So that's how we do the bigger community all together, working together to have a harmonious, community culture. But then if we have a conflict, so again, if it's like Rebecca and Cassidy, we're having, a disagreement because, I said I was going to use that stick, but you really thought you were going to use that stick, but you put it down and you didn't tell me you were going to come back and use it. You know what I'm saying? One of those things, right? That happens. And so what we really ask the kids to do, we're really trying to teach them this, because this is something that a lot of kids haven't really been supported in doing, is just taking a couple deep breaths and checking in with your body, right? Yeah. Like, how often do we do that as adults when we get triggered? I don't think, or something happens at all. I mean, personally, I struggle so much doing it, right? And it's because I was told at some point in my, development that wasn't as important, right, as something else. As my self-care and my internal, connection with my mind and my body isn't as important as what's on the board or whatever, right? So we try to really encourage them to do that. And we do for younger kids, we do the blow a bubble into our hand. So we'll hold our hand out and they'll blow a pretend bubble. So to kind of help them with the breathing thing, we try to make it fun. And oftentimes there's not a staff member that's there to intervene when something's going on. So we try to help them learn to have those conversations with themselves and also support each other. So if an 8-year-old kid sees a 6-year-old kid about to get, you can tell that the 6-year-old's about to get angry, the 8-year-old might go over and go, hey, blow a bubble into my hand. Like, and it's so not, and there's no loadedness to it. It's not manipulative. It's just something that we've kind of brought in and that they're integrating into a tool that they have. So the first step is, of course, to like take a deep breath and, kind of connect with yourself and figure out what your needs are. But then, try to communicate to the person that you have an issue with, right? So we kind of teach the kids to first talk to the person you have a, problem with, and share with them, like, what your need is, really trying to do nonviolent communication, even though it's harder for younger kids. Yeah. But kind of saying like, when you did this, it made me feel this, would you be willing to do this? From there, if that does not work, right, if they're not able to come to some kind of resolution from there, then they are, empowered to reach out to either a staff mentor, or there's a bunch of learners that have volunteered to actually be mediators. So those kids are, volunteers in community meeting, they stand up, everybody knows who they are. So you can also, quickly find, my sister Clara went to EPIC, for example. So Clara might be outside at that time, and there might not be a staff member out all the time because it's self-directed learning and we trust you, but they might go, hey, Clara, we're struggling with this conflict. Could you come over and support us? And then any other learner or staff can do that at that time. But we try to really support them in moving through it on their own. And then like if a staff member comes in and it's still, there's too much tension, maybe there needs to be a day, maybe there needs to be more conversation with peers. We have a group called Culture Committee. So say something happened like continuously, right? Like if you and I had a conflict where I was like, this was my stick and I was playing with it, and you were like, no, it was my stick. And then we just keep having issues over this stick and we're not changing our pattern. Sometimes we bring that to a group called Culture Committee, which is all of those kids that I told you about that volunteer to mediate. They also volunteer to be a part of a committee of people that just really hear issues that are recurring in the community. So if there's a recurring issue, we had a kid that just wouldn't stop spitting at people, for example. And I mean, it was for whatever reason, it's just like, this is what he did when he was really mad. He just spit at people. And I think there were times where we tried to intervene as staff and help mediate. There were times where other kids did, and it just really didn't, pan out. But when we brought it to Culture Committee, he was really validated. The other kids could almost like ground into what, maybe why he was spitting. They asked a lot of really great questions about like, did something happen before you spit? When you spit, how does that make you feel? Is there something that you also that feels like that when you spit, but it's not spitting, that you could do when you're angry? Like questions that I'm not even thinking to ask as an adult, and solutions and ideas, and also just validating what he's going through while still holding that like, hey, we're not going to spit at people though. Right.
Yeah. That's really awesome that
it's like a mixed age.
Yeah.
It's like a mixed range age group too. So it's like kids that, could be from 8 to 18 or a little bit younger sometimes, talking to those kids about what's going on with them.
I love that idea. I think it shows, what Peter Gray talks so much about, that sometimes those mixed age groups are so much better about helping, providing the necessary and needed tools for other kids than more so than an adult could ever do, because they have, they're maybe closer in age. They understand more of maybe the feelings that kid may be struggling with more so than an adult with an adult brain, that makes it
completely.
So, yeah. And I love the fact,
it's so beautiful to feel that they can do that, because then when we can actually bring things, I feel like I bring things to them and I know they're going to have ideas I didn't think of. And I know that that's something like I knew philosophically going in, but to actually see that all come to fruition and really be true has been just really cool, because I mean, I thought it in theory, but it's been really cool to actually see that happen. Yeah.
That's really awesome. Well, I love the fact that you're teaching that mindfulness. I feel like even today as an adult, like I really can't come into full, like I don't understand myself as well as I could if I had learned skills like this as a young child. Like, how am I really feeling and what, because I think there's so much emotion going on in our world right now. And a lot of us are totally clueless, like what's really the feelings behind that, type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to hear more about like that democratic understanding. Whenever we hear about democracy, sometimes it's put forth in positive light, but I feel like lately we all have this idea like that, what is it, that the wolf and the sheep get to decide what's for dinner, and then that there's always a segment of the population that kind of gets screwed over basically, or that kind of have to conform to what everybody else wants. And is it different in like a democratic school, or is it just that kind of thing, like, okay, well, we took a vote and whatever you're doing is wrong, and I don't know, or however you feel is wrong? Like does that make sense? Like with the democratic?
It completely makes sense. Everything you're saying makes sense. So I'm just trying to also figure out how to respond without like lumping a specific type of self-directed education in that category, because in my experience, sometimes very self-directed learning communities that try to use a one-to-one direct democracy where there is actually a vote is different than EPIC. But I did intern at places where that happened, right? Where there was a school meeting every day, and if you showed up, you showed up, and if you didn't show up, you didn't get a vote. Everybody got one vote, whether you were an adult or a kid. And yet the reality was, like you were saying, to a point, the stronger voices, the people that are able to get everybody on their team, or even just that have more friends or whatever their leverage is, can really push an agenda. It's a real thing. It is a real concern, in my opinion, that we need to be careful for. And I think also adults do it and they don't realize it. So you think you're not exerting extra, power when you have just one vote. But if you're the one raising your hand talking all the meeting,
Yeah, you have the persuasive power, basically.
And in the bigger society, the adults do have the power. So it's hard to like say that that wouldn't already, of course, come into play. I mean, I think that's something we just always have to acknowledge to younger people is like, you're going to constantly feel like I have this like power thing over you, and we're going to be constantly dismantling it, and I'm going to be working on it all the time. And it's fair that if you question it, because everybody in the world is, you know, oppressing you to a point, in my opinion. So it's fair to feel like every adult's going to try to do that. But so I think there's just a lot to work on as an adult in a self-directed learning community, to just really watch yourself and also have those open lines of communication so young people can tell you like, hey, I feel like you're really just making this decision but we could all decide together, or whatever, you know? So yes, back to what you were asking me, if you look at a democratic school and you think about it like using a one-to-one direct democracy, those kinds of things can happen, in my opinion, and it is a problem. What I love about Thomas and Nancy, who created the Agile Learning Centers, they blew my mind. I went to the AERO conference, which is the Alternative Education Resource Organization conference, and it blew my mind when they said, what about, those 7 kids voted yes, but what about those 3 kids that voted no? Like, what about their need? Is there a need that they have that's not going to get met now? And is that really how we want to function in a new type of community that we're creating, that we're wanting to empower kids? And we're still going to hold this structure that we know in the US as a whole also doesn't work, right? Because there's a certain group that's represented and there's groups that aren't. And there's people that's needs are getting met and there's people that aren't.
And there's like weaker societies that never get a voice and get, almost taken advantage of in a way.
Completely.
And then I think too, I think that's what's fueling a lot of our frustration, our community now, is that, you know, we all want autonomy over our own lives, and we just don't feel like we really have a choice in it. You know, it's always laid out to us by the powers that be of how things are going to go out. And it's always for the strongest in the community, not for the individual person who just wants to live a good life, you know, type of thing.
Right.
Right.
So I think the way that we do it at Epic is a little bit different. So it's kind of like when I was telling you about the conversation with the parent and the kid and the staff member, but with all the young people. So when we're in those community awareness meetings and Tom is like, hey, not cool, people are riding my scooter, right? When we come up with practices, we're all just brainstorming. We're throwing practices out there. Okay, maybe John puts his scooter over in the other corner so everybody knows it's his. Maybe, do you know what I mean? Like there's and there's no bad idea at that phase of the meeting. And then what we do is we say, okay, what's something that we're all willing to try? Not our favorite idea, right? You know what I mean? What's the best idea? It's what's something that we can all like consent to trying for a week. And then we check up on it and see how it's going. And then we can always try something new next week or iterate something else, or even sooner than next week if it needs to be sooner. If it's like a pressing thing, right? We have the meeting 3 times a week. And so that's more how we do it. So instead of saying, okay, let's all vote on this rule, right? And it's going to be, 7-3, the rules passed that John can't bring his scooter, or that John brings his scooter, but
everybody gets to ride it. He just has
right.
to
And that's the rule. Yes. And that's just the rule. And so it's not nearly as the whole point of Agile learning communities is it's not as agile. The whole beauty of what I love about the Agile learning process is there's not these big, heavy rules. It's like, what's the practice we're currently using for that? And then is the practice supporting, implementing, the awareness not happening in the future? Like, is it working? Is it becoming a norm? And then that's just how it works. So it's not something that we have to then, when a new kid comes in, here's all the rules. Here's the big rule book of all of the rules we've made in our democratic community, read up and make sure you don't break any rules, right? It's so different than that. And it's much more like, these are integrated practices that we do as a community that we definitely still help, the learners understand, but it's not this big, heavy, can't change. It feels like you can't change it. It feels very, I don't know if I'm saying bureaucratic. It feels very like paperwork heavy. There's a lot when it comes into that can happen. But I love the more consent-based model that Agile uses. Yeah. And we use that at Epic.
Yeah, I'm hoping that as a society, we could learn to get to that where back to that individual rights, where each one of us have a right to kind of pursue our own life, liberty, and happiness. And I think it's important. It's invaluable to teach kids how to debate and whatever. But I wish we could get to a place where we just don't want to step on another person, that we just we're okay with okay, that person, this is his thing and this is what he wants and it's important to him. And so, we leave it alone, even though the rest of us want to ride that kid's scooter, type of thing.
Completely.
Anyway.
Completely. So. And that, that's something that we're seeing in the society that we have right now too, right? Is sharing freedom. And we're seeing that with, COVID-19 and face masks and all of that kind of stuff, right? Of just like, different people having different views on what needs to be done there. And it's a similar conversation about everything at Epic is just like, okay, where does my freedom extend until it infringes upon yours? What's my responsibility? What's yours?
Yeah.
So that we can have this freedom, but it's grounded in the reality that you have a responsibility and there will be, an impact.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the face mask thing is still just a thing you hear all the time. Well, if you're a good member of society or whatever, but I don't know. There's just a lot of that. There's so much shaming going on in our society anymore. And that's what I would hope that with these type of schools that we can kind of get away from that. Because I really feel like a lot of the problems that we have in our society almost came from, well, first of all, the whole hierarchy, of like, I'm an adult or I'm an upperclassman, so I can bully and pick and whatever on you as a weak underclassmen type of thing. And then not really listening or caring, but, my way or the highway because I'm stronger than you versus really understanding like some basic principles of being a good person. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. And I think it's interesting because sometimes those authoritarian structures can really dominate the more egalitarian structures, even though egalitarian structures are much more like based in human need and like understanding and community and love. But sometimes those authoritarian structures just dominate. It's almost like there's no room for anything else. Even if it's a very strong community. It's so interesting.
Yeah. Well, the rest of our interview is supposed to kind of go a different way, more of like, what you're doing in your own personal life. But I really love, just with the COVID-19, we're seeing a huge change in we have so many parents trying to like rethink what their education is going to look like for their kids. And teachers, teachers are not happy with what the proposed classrooms are going to be looking like now because they're like, how do I teach in that? It's already a struggle. And then you're putting all these extra restrictions on me. What do you feel like a parent or a teacher can do to maybe create this own environment for themselves and for maybe select community members around that are interested in maybe looking at a different style of, learning center versus what we've had with our regular traditional schools?
Just to clarify, are you asking me like what are some things that like some advice to keep in mind when looking maybe at different options, or are you?
Yeah, let's start with advice for looking for different options, but what if they don't find that option and they want to create something like this?
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think that a lot of families are definitely considering homeschooling or doing something alternative than the traditional model. I'm seeing some public schools are saying, we're going to have 5 hours in front of the computer every day. Other schools are doing different things, but some schools are doing some pretty, things that I could understand why a lot of parents would go, "Ooh, is there just not some other option for my young person that could be a better use of their time that's not just in front of a screen
and healthier for them?"
Yeah. Exactly. And more expansive. So I think, one of the first things I would say is just looking at the, Alliance for Self-Directed Education website, looking at the resource directory for learning communities in your area. They have a listing that includes homeschool co-ops and communities and also includes like self-directed schools and then just, again, self-directed learning communities, which sometimes are schools, sometimes are homeschool resource centers, depending on your state and what the laws are there. For Texas, it's the same. So if you're a homeschooler, you're in private school. If you're in private school, you're a homeschooler. It's a very interesting thing legally. So I would say the Alliance for Self-Directed Education is a great place to look. Also the Arrow website, which is I think educationrevolution.org. They have a great listing. If you don't find something that's specifically self-directed, you might find something on there that's more Montessori based, or maybe is like kind of like we mentioned earlier, a charter school that's more flexible or trying to be more creative with what they're doing. So you definitely could find different communities there. If there's still not one in your area, I think that the first thing I would start doing, which is what I kind of started doing when I was still teaching public school, was I just started hosting like meetups at a local library. And I just put it on Facebook and was like, hey, does anybody want to talk about like the future of education or like progressive education? Sometimes I put progressive education just because, sometimes alternative education, people think negatively with that word, or like, let's imagine what next year could look like. And I would just host little like coffee meetups at, different libraries and just meet people that are asking similar questions than me. And sometimes they're a little bit different questions, but oftentimes they have a similar need, especially if you're someone that's a family that's looking for other families that's wanting to do something collaboratively, but different. I think that would be a great first step, is just finding like-minded families in your area and starting to meet up and imagine what learning together could be like, figuring out, what are y'all's individual strengths as families, and then how could you use that to create some kind of co-op. But I think that before all of those things, I think just really going back to what we were talking about before of just like, you got to grapple with the fact that like whatever you think learning was supposed to be, or whatever you think kids did in traditional school is not really what's happening, right? So you think a kid's learning from, 9 to 4, they're not. Right.
Yeah.
And so there's all these things that you just believe about young people and learning, and that learning looks this way. Learning looks like sitting down in front of a notebook and writing stuff down. Learning doesn't look fun, or learning doesn't look like, going on a field trip somewhere, but it really can look so much like anything. So I think that's a huge thing that adults everywhere are going to just have to continue to work through, is we've romanticized and modeled this idea of this is how learning looks. And we have to just like really let that go, which is a huge process. So I would say the biggest thing I would request every parent, this is like not just self-directed, you want to be a self-directed parent, but just any parent, the self-driven child. The self-driven child, amazing. And it's totally tangible ways to help your kid have more autonomy, even within some systems that are, not ideal. Yeah. So I think that that's just a great place to start when you're thinking about giving your child more autonomy, whether it's in their education or just at home, because if you're spending more time with your kid at home and there's some, tense stuff going on, oftentimes it's because they feel like their autonomy is being threatened, or that they're not given autonomy, over their life. So I think that that's the work that really needs to be done, is like parents and kids also just let's really just break down learning doesn't have to look like the way we thought it did. I think that'll open up a lot of doors for people for homeschooling in the fall and in the spring. Yeah. They can really just kind of try to divorce from that mindset.
Yeah, I think this was another thing I was thinking of, that, we hear in the traditional public school system that they put a lot of shaming back onto our families because a lot of our families are dysfunctional and stuff like that. Do you feel like that's been another side of like working with these kids, that maybe they're coming from dysfunctional families who aren't supportive of this style of learning, so then they come back into this environment and, that strong discipline, authoritarian thing's gone, and then they don't know how to deal with all that freedom, basically? Or
I think, yeah. And I think also then sometimes it's hard because when you show them a way that they can be with an adult that's not that way, that has more of that freedom, and then they go home to it not being that way, they start pushing back, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes at home. So then the parents like, what the heck, my kid's acting more rebellious than they were before. They were already saying they didn't want to go to school. They were already refusing to go to school. And now you've got them saying no to me or whatever, right? And so we've definitely seen, I would say, like a huge need for family services within self-directed education. I mean, obviously in general, right? I think there's a huge need for family services and support just in general, societally. But I think zooming into EPIC, I think it is a really big thing, because if the parent doesn't buy in, it's really hard for the young person, because then they're constantly like, well, my parent doesn't think I'm really learning. Like my actual parents don't think that I'm being a productive member of society and doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Yeah. And that's a really hard thing. Like society can tell you that, but then if your parents also feel that way, because that can happen if a kid's in crisis or they're refusing to go to school, the parent's just like, where can I put them? Right. And the parent may not be interested in really learning about the philosophy of why EPIC exists and, all of our backgrounds. They really are just like, my kid's in crisis and they won't go to school and I don't know what to do. So here. Right.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And I think that can be really challenging for the child and for us, because what they really need is a lot of family counseling in addition to their child having an opportunity to be self-directed.
Yeah.
Because there's so much fear and other things coming into that home environment that bleed so heavily into what they feel they can do at EPIC and just as people.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that we are building into. We have one of our staff members has a background in social work, which has been a huge benefit to us. But I mean, I've thought about even having like a branch of our nonprofit having some kind of family services element, because I just think it really is important. Whether it's, again, it doesn't have to be that you're doing something harmful to your child, like overtly, right? But it could be like you're covertly like have this manipulative dynamic or this like codependent dynamic you don't know about and that you need to work through. And oftentimes those are created by these other systems of like making sure your kid does their homework, or like you're saying, my child is a direct reflection of myself. And so I have to make sure they're perfect. And there's a lot that can go to that. You're not trying to not be a helpful parent, but you don't see what you don't see. And then when you bring them to self-directed and you think that's going to be the solution, it's like, that's part of it.
Yeah. But I think a lot of parents feel that they're perfect and that whatever their child is doing is not. And but when it's somewhat of a direct reflection. Actually, that's one reason I'm trying to shift my, like, the focus of, I used to talk a lot about homeschooling and what to do with our kids and all these different models. And I found that so many parents are like, well, how do I get my kids to do X, Y, and Z? And I started kind of pushing, like, you can't make your kids do anything, and realizing, like, okay, we are having a parenting crisis. Like, parents have been shoved out of the way so often. I mean, to the fact that now the school feeds them. They pretty much provide them everything that you're almost like a weekend babysitter type of thing. I mean, that's what parents have become. So we've lost our skill to parent. We've lost that. We can handle it usually up until the child is like 3 years old, and then all of a sudden we're wanting to get rid of them and put it back on somebody else. But it really comes down to the fact, like, because we've done this for decades or for many generations, we've lost that innate power to parent and to mentor, and to understand our role isn't necessarily to make our kids do anything. It's to provide a good model for them, hopefully an extension of what you're already trying to do with these democratic schools, but that we're working with our young people and realizing we're, like, not perfect ourselves. We
modeling, right?
Yeah, I got a ton of flaws that I'm working on as well, and working through that, and maybe not having that just huge authoritarian, like, I'm the boss, I'm the adult over you, and I get to decide type of attitude.
And like you said, that works for a certain amount of time. Like, I think we had, one family that had a 17-year-old join us, and it was like, he refused to go to school. It's like, okay, what are they going to do? Are they going to pick him up and put him in the car? He's 17 years old. He's a pretty strong young human.
Yeah.
He's not going anywhere. He's not doing it. Like, and it doesn't matter what, you know what I mean? There's nothing that they can take away from him that really honestly matters for him in that specific thing. He's just not going to go. But I think the problem is that we still also, even though we've taken the empowerment completely away from the parent and said, okay, here, we're the government, give us your kid and we're going to educate them and leave us alone. And don't ask questions, don't bother us, because then you're this needy, annoying parent. Right. Yeah. But then on the flip side, if your kid refuses to go to school because school's not a safe place for them, you're going to be the one that gets in charge for truancy and has, fines and then, criminal prosecution and different things like that, because you're not willing or you're not able to force physically your 17-year-old to go to school. And that's just a whole thing. It's like, why are we even at that place, right? Why is that even something that's happening? And it totally goes back to the role of the parent and the family versus the role of government schooling. And it's just become extremely warped and twisted into each other and out in ways that just don't even make sense, but are happening.
Yeah.
And we're used to.
Well, and sadly, I see parents that instinctually feel like I should be doing this or that for my child, but they always want to check with the expert, I should say, and they don't follow that intuition, and then that creates bigger problems. I know a ton of parents that feel like I feel like I should homeschool my kids, but then I talk with the school and they're like, oh, well, that would be bad for these number of reasons, or just having a feeling like as a parent, I think when you have a child, something gives you that natural intuition that maybe if we followed more as parents, and I mean, not making kids do that, but just going, okay, well, maybe this isn't working, instead of feeling like there's always an expert that knows better than me as a parent, I
really do feel like that's very true, that people, and it's similar to like me when I left public school teaching of like, what am I qualified to do? Like, I don't feel qualified. Like, parents really don't feel qualified to homeschool their child. And it's like, you really are. I feel like they feel extremely disempowered.
Yeah.
Like you're saying.
Well, and I think the humility of a parent and the willingness to want to learn, your own curiosity is like your best tool that you can have. It's not your knowledge. So
completely.
That's great.
And your time, your willingness to sit down.
Yeah.
And, have time with them.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, what do you feel like to move people in this direction? You gave some great resources. I actually just interviewed the authors for The Self-Driven Child. Hopefully I'll get to do it with their second book too, because it's amazing. But so you've given some great resources, but what are some habits you feel like that could kind of move parents or even teachers into kind of this more democratic way of thinking, or this idea that education is like a way of life and not just a school type of thing?
I think one of the habits that I've just started to create for myself is just questioning everything, right? Questioning every system that we currently use, every structure that's in place. Every time I'm like, oh, but X kid should be learning X by X time. It's like, well, let's question that, or we should be doing X, Y, Z So really just questioning a lot of the status quo in general, I think is a huge habit that's helpful, because it usually leads to a lot of extended learning as well, regardless.
Yeah.
And then I think also just like really being willing to sacrifice comfort for following your, like you're saying, that inner intuition, that inner voice, because it feels really uncomfortable at first, because again, we've been taught to kind of turn that voice off, but like really leaning into that and saying like, I know this isn't comfortable for me, but it will become comfortable. It actually becomes like over time a very, like you can tap into it easier, and then you're like, really in tune and in alignment with who you are. And then you can, move forward into your purpose easier.
Well, and I think a lot of teachers would, when you talk about sacrificing comfort, I can't imagine when you have a job with the district, you have insurance and you have a guaranteed pay raise and you have all that kind of thing. Isn't that even to sacrifice that comfort? Because when you start one of these centers, you're probably going to start a lower pay scale and stuff like that. Is that?
Oh, 100%. That's a huge thing. That was one of the biggest things that when I would talk to my friends when I was leaving public school, they're like, what are you doing? You have health insurance, you're going to continue to make more money every year. You've got your retirement system that's growing. And, there's so many reasons to stay, right? I have all these kids that are, growing up, but are going to graduate. So I was going to wait till my first kids graduated before I left. Like there's all these things that you can put weight on yourself and hold yourself back. But the reality is like, if you're the person that's willing to step out of that and put yourself out there and like shed some of those like weights, you're the one that's going to be out there doing it when no one else is doing it. And so it doesn't matter if you're the perfectly qualified person, because you were willing to sacrifice that comfort for your dream. And that's the people that end up making those things come to life, right? Not the people that are just a little bit too scared or, living in that comfort.
That's cool. Yeah. And I feel like when we can do that, when we can sacrifice the comfort for that dream, we end up living a happier, healthier life, because, not everything I guess all things don't provide happiness. It's really those passion driven feelings that we might have.
Right. Like for me, it was moving in back with my mom. I didn't love the idea of doing that, but it saved me, $1,000 in rent a month for a year so that I could go do my self-directed, sabbatical visit to different learning communities.
It was cool. She let you too.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. She took me back. It was so great. So yeah, exactly. But that was some of my friends were like, oh my God, you're moving in with your mom at 26. You know what I mean? There's so much of that. That's just like, well, I had the big apartment in Dallas and, but you have to be willing to cut down those things. There's that financial status part or insecurity, honestly, truly, that come into play too in your mind. And that's hard to reckon with.
Yeah. Well, tell me, what do you feel like your long-term goals are, and how does that work into the legacy that you hope? I know whenever I ask a really young person this, they're like, I'm not really even thinking about that. But.
Right. And I don't even feel like I feel like a young person in so many ways, but I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got so much to do and I'm running out of time. I already feel that way. So I know what you mean. I saw this question and I was like, oh, my legacy. Oh my gosh. I think that like long-term, I would love to just support and help create more learning communities in the South. So I would love to be a part of creating multiple, either EPIC style or just like maybe supporting in consulting, helping other people create learning communities while continuing to grow EPIC and possibly have multiple centers of EPIC. I think also what I'd mentioned to you too, part of long-term would be, having a family services element, having an element where we can bring in maybe having a summer camp opportunity for all kids, even kids in public school, to experience self-directed learning. In some kind of environment like that. That'd be cool. Doing a lot of giving back is something that I really see EPIC doing long-term and us doing long-term as a self-directed movement, but we're still at the point where we're kind of building ourselves up, but I think there is a lot of ways that we can give back. So that's definitely a part of my long-term vision for EPIC and then just for myself in general. Another thing I'm really passionate about long-term is teacher liberation. So I know you and I talked about that a little bit, but I could talk about that forever. Just helping teachers, like you said, like we go from being in school to teaching in school. And so just really helping us like say, okay, you don't have to be stuck. And if you're not happy, it's okay. And there's nothing wrong with you. And it doesn't mean you don't care about kids. You know what I mean? So even just that whole, like helping teachers divorce from school if they're not happy in the traditional environment, and whether it's moving into self-directed or doing something different. I think it's important because I think unhappy teachers, it doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of brainwashing among teachers. I mean, I remember years ago, my son was like a baby, and I remember, telling somebody that my sister was going to be in a charter school, and the teacher was just like devastated. How can you take money away from students? And and as I've grown, I'm like, well, really, it's sad that you feel that way, because that gives more job opportunities, so you don't have to rely on that teachers union to make sure that you have a job, that you have, just like every other profession, you have autonomy to move and be in the place you want to be. How horrible would it be if we just had one company that you had to go work at, regardless of what was going on in that company or how that the culture of that company or whatever, you were stuck there. I just think that would be devastating to your soul almost, you know what I mean? But I feel like it perpetuates itself. There's so much almost brainwashing, of what happens either in unions or I'm not really sure. Maybe you as a teacher.
In the teacher's lounge, it happens. I think brainwashing for what you can do as an educator for sure. I think that there's also the level of oh, you're going to leave the kids. They really need you. And it's even if you're, there's just that whole part too. There's lots of layers of it. And then again, feeling unfit to do anything else if you've pretty much been in education your entire life. So to think that you're going to go out and do something different is on another level, pretty scary.
Well, I think that too, the fact that a lot of people don't feel like as an educator you can make money. It's almost like you're being shamed. This is all about, I don't know how to describe it, but they almost look at themselves in a way that it puffs their chest up to think well, I don't do my job for money. I'm here to
your service. You're serving. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But at the same time, I look at teachers pay teachers, and there's teachers there that when they come up with amazing, ways of helping their students, they are making money. And so I think we can even think wow, let's look outside the box, this idea of abundance versus I've got to stay here, and sacrifice money over, you know what I mean? It's almost like this really scarcity mindset in a way. So.
It is. And it's I'm sacrificing for these kids, and you become almost a little bit of a victim or a martyr a little bit. And that can be a very ego serving thing. Yeah. I think with teachers, it's such a hard thing. So I think that that's something that my heart is just really drawn to, because I think in self-directed education, and like you mentioned earlier, with this shift and people probably moving more towards homeschooling and alternatives to traditional education, we're going to have a huge need for facilitators.
Yeah.
Self-directed facilitators. We're going to have a need. I already have a need. I need somebody next year if you know anybody. For EPIC.
I wish I lived closer.
Right? Come on. So the thing is that we need to be, as self-directed, people in this movement, we need to be creating pathways. It doesn't need to be as convoluted as it felt for me when I was leaving. There can be pathways that make it more possible and less scary for future educators to move into self-directed education. And I did a talk for Arrow about that, because I just think that we need to have mentors in self-directed education that are willing to be mentors for free to teachers wanting to move into this field, so that they can have, because I had Blake that I could call. I had Ken and Joel that I could pick up the phone and call and say, okay, I'm thinking about leaving. What the heck am I supposed to do? And how long should I visit this learning community versus this learning community? And what do you think I can offer from this? It was so helpful to have mentors. So I think that teachers, just like kids, are stuck too, and they need people to support them in leaving just as much as young people do.
Yeah, it's that piece of collaboration again that I think has kind of been a thread throughout self-directed learning centers for sure. That collaboration, we need that among teachers for sure. That's great. Mm-hmm. Well, what final parting advice would you give our listeners? And then give us your contact information so people, if they want to collaborate with you, they know how.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I think again, I'll just reiterate a little bit. The biggest thing is just getting uncomfortable and putting yourself out there always. I think that the biggest thing I've seen is that when you just are always talking about and putting yourself in situations where you are immersed in your passions, everybody sees you lit up and they want to be involved. They want to somehow connect with you. They want to, or later they will. And so that's what I've seen, is that even though there was really no clear path for me to leave public education, what I did do was that I just kept putting myself out there and asking people and talking to people and going places and feeling uncomfortable, but talking about what I believed in. And that's really what completely created the opportunities, all of the opportunities that I've had so far, and has allowed me to really live out my dream. So I would just encourage everybody else to do that as much as they can. work and put yourself out there, put your passion out there, and everything will come back to you, I think.
Yeah. I just did a podcast with Jeremy from Crash Co, and he talks about like learning out loud. Like sometimes if we, like you said, just start asking questions to people and really start that learning process out loud, it can help you maybe find the resources that you're needing, or at least like lead you to other questions or other resources that might be helpful in your own personal development. Definitely.
100%. And then, just really valuing all of the people that have helped you along the way. Yeah. I think is just a huge piece too, is just letting them know, right? Because like sometimes you see how big of an impact they had, but maybe they don't see it yet. So definitely also telling them, because they're the wind at your back, right? Like,
definitely. I love that. Well, and then your contact information.
Yeah. So EPIC's website is epiclifelearningcommunity.com. We're also on Instagram and Facebook. And then if you want to find me, the website is CassidyYounghans.com, or you can find me on Instagram or Facebook at Cassidy Alice Younghans.
That's awesome. So today we've been chatting with Cassidy Younghans. To find out more about her, you can find her on Facebook. I love the epiclifelearningcommunity.com. I'm going to link it up with our website as well, if I end up getting some of these wrong as we're talking about them. But thank you so much, Cassidy, for coming on and really connecting with the Luminous Mind to teach us about self-directed education. I really appreciate it.
I've had so much fun being on this podcast with you. It's been so great. I love you guys' vision at Luminous Mind, and I think that everything that you guys have created so far is super exciting. So I can't wait to hear the final result.
Thank you for listening to The Luminous Mind. Music featured in this episode from Scott Holmes. To learn more about our podcast, check us out at theluminousmind.net.